we go to hotels because we want to be treated, right? Because the idea of sleeping in fresh sheets and linens and fresh towels and stuff every day is a luxury to many. How does that work if you're trying to protect the environment at the same time? What can hotels do? What can I do as the individual?
I think most hotels have caught on to the fact that the guests actually don't want fresh towels or fresh sheets every day. Most hotels give you the option now, which I think is always a nice thing, is to give the guests the option to say, look, you can have fresh sheets every day, but we would like to recommend, or we have an option, opt out kind of thing. So I think you can always look at, like, how long am I staying here? Do I need room service every day? Again, if you're in a business hotel, you're there for 3 days, you don't really need room service, or maybe you just need it once instead of 3 days. So it's sort of thinking about what are the things you need and what are the things you want, and then weighing those up. And as I said, the hotels now give you a lot more options than they used to.
It seems as if we're always getting sort of conflicting advice on, ditch plastic, don't eat avocados. And we're like, how do you cut through that noise and, know what you could actually really do to make a difference?
It is terrible. As a consumer, you're totally overloaded. And also because it's a bit unfair. It's like the message has been to the consumer, it's all your fault. And quite frankly, it's all the fault of the fossil fuel companies, really, if we drilled it down to where the main emissions come from. So this guilting out the consumer is not a fair ride, but guilting out the consumer is guilting out the consumer in the developing countries where we have the biggest carbon emissions or the biggest impact on the environment. So clearly, that's a very easy win, is like, we'd all need to consume less. Okay, so how do we do that? We can look at, where is my biggest impact? Do I want to fly less? Do I want to eat less meat? Do I want to just maybe turn my heating down? I think it's really for every individual to say, where do I think that I have the biggest impact? And then focus on that. I once read this really interesting article about charity and how do you give to charity, right? Because a lot of us could just end up like giving to a lot of causes, but that doesn't really create an impact. So maybe choose one area where you feel you have the biggest carbon footprint or the biggest negative impact, and that's where you start making the change. And then make those changes bit by bit. And I think, as long as you are conscious of what you're consuming and don't overconsume, that is really all we can do. And if you still don't feel it's good enough, then you find an organization that you want to get involved in and get active about it. But to always dump it all on the consumer is really not the only solution, quite frankly, and it's not a fair solution either.
But if I'm the individual who really wants to make a change, how do I identify what I can really do? How do I make that list?
Well, we all know that the biggest emissions really come from eating meat, because meat production has a huge amount of water impact, water usage, carbon. You then have the methane. So if we've reduced our meat consumption down already to at least, once a week, that's already great, especially when it comes to beef. Pork is the way they keep pigs is terrible anyway. So I would recommend that's a really big and easy, low-hanging fruit to have. Again, like looking at your travel, often if you have to fly for work, I think we all fly a lot less now that we have Teams and Zoom calls. But when you're going on holiday, how are you going on holiday? Can you also take shorter trips with the train? Looking at those sort of emissions. And then I do actually think, your own energy consumption at home. Like, are we always all leaving all the lights on? That the good old fashioned sort of from our parents in the oil crisis of the 70s, right? Turn all the lights off. Yeah, we can turn all the lights off now too. And don't always have the heating on. So I think it's just looking at your own habits. I think we all know now, and the information is out there. If you just, Google biggest impact in living in Germany or living in the US or the UK, it pretty much tells you where you can make a change to your habits. And in workshops, we did a lot of sort of exercises. It takes about 30 days to shed a habit, and it takes about 30 days to take up a habit. So be patient with yourself when you're doing these things also. And then slowly, bit by bit, they become part of your normal life.